Welcome to the Surviving to Thriving podcast with Jim Squire. I'm a licensed psychotherapist here in Canada, and the title of this episode is The Stories We've Lived By. In the last episode, we talked about the nervous system, how it gets shaped in the early years of our life, and how it learns what's safe and what isn't, and how those lessons quietly run in the background of everything we do as adults. If you haven't listened to that one yet, I'd encourage you to go back and start there. It's called Wired Young, What Your Nervous System Never Forgot. Today I want to go a little deeper, because it's not just our nervous system that gets shaped in childhood, it's also the stories we start to tell about ourselves, who we are, what we deserve, whether we're fundamentally okay or fundamentally not. And those are stories formed when we were small, had very little understanding of what was happening around us, and have a way of following us into our adult lives in ways we don't even recognize. So let's get right into it. I want to start with something I hear in my practice more than almost anything else. Not always in these exact words, but in some version of it. Sayings like, I'm too much, or I'm not enough, or I don't really deserve to take up space. If people really knew me, they'd leave. These aren't just passing thoughts. For a lot of people, these are deep, settled convictions, things they've believed about themselves for so long, they've stopped questioning whether they're actually true. They just feel true. They feel like facts. What I want to explore today is where beliefs like that actually come from. Because they don't arrive out of nowhere. They're formed. They were learned. They were learned at a time in our lives when we almost had no capacity to question them. And here's something I think is really important to understand about children. They don't just experience things, they make meaning out of what they experience. Something happens, the child's mind immediately tries to explain it, to make sense of it, because that's what minds do. They look for patterns, they look for reasons. They try to create order out of what's happening around them. The problem is that a child's ability to make meaning is limited by their age and their understanding of the world. A young child doesn't have the cognitive capacity to think, my parent is overwhelmed right now, or my parent is dealing with their own pain, or this family is going through something difficult that has nothing to do with me. A child's world is small, and they are at the center of it. So when something painful happens, the explanation a child tends to land on is, this is about me, and there must be something wrong with me. A child will almost always find a way to make painful experiences their own fault. Not because they're wrong, but because it's the only explanation that makes the world feel controllable. Think about that for a moment. If a parent is cold or absent or critical or unpredictable, and a child concludes that the parent is the problem, then the world is obviously unsafe, uncontrollable. That's terrifying. But if the child concludes that they are the problem, that they're too much or not enough or somehow fundamentally flawed, or at least there's something they can do about it. They could try harder, they can do better, they can make themselves smaller. The belief that something is wrong with them is actually more bearable than the belief that the world is simply unsafe. So children typically make that trade, often without knowing they're making it, and the belief gets laid down quietly, deeply. It starts to feel like truth. I want to walk through a few of the most common patterns I see in adults, not to put anyone in a box, but because sometimes hearing your own experience named clearly is the first step towards understanding it differently. There's a child who is never quite enough. Maybe they grew up in a household where love felt conditional, where approval had to be earned, where achievements were expected but rarely celebrated. There was always a higher bar to reach. That child learns a very specific story. My worth is in what I produce. As an adult, they often work incredibly hard. They're driven, capable, highly functioning, by every external measure, yet there's a persistent sense of emptiness underneath it all, a feeling that no matter how much they achieve, it never quite fills whatever it is they're looking for. Because whatever they're looking for isn't another accomplishment, it's the experience of being enough, just as they are. That's something no achievement can give them. There's also a child that learned that love wasn't safe. Maybe love in their household came with unpredictable moments of warmth, followed by withdrawal, closeness that would suddenly turn cold. The child learns to brace themselves in relationships. As an adult, they might desperately want connection, but find themselves pulling away just as things get close. Or they might find themselves anxious and hypervigilant in relationships, always monitoring, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Not because their partner has actually given them a reason to, but because their nervous system and their story says this is how love goes. Then there's a child that also had to grow up too fast. Maybe they became emotional caretaker for a parent. Maybe they learned to read the room from a very early age, to manage other people's feelings, to put their own needs last, because there simply wasn't space for them. As an adult, that pattern often shows up as an enormous capacity for empathy and care for others, and an almost complete inability to receive it. Asking for help feels wrong, needing something feels like a burden, taking up space feels selfish. And underneath all of that is usually a child who learned very early on that their needs didn't really matter. I'll be honest about something here. A lot of what I've just described isn't abstract for me. I recognize pieces of these patterns in my own life. Working hard, the sense that enough is never quite enough, learning to be capable and self-sufficient in ways that sometimes made it hard to let people in. And I think that's part of why this work matters so much to me, not just professionally, but personally. Just because there's something really significant that happens when you start to see your own patterns with a little more clarity. Not to judge them, not to be ashamed of them, but to understand where they came from, to recognize that the version of you that developed these patterns was doing the best they possibly could with what they had at the time. And that understanding, that genuine compassion for yourself, is where something starts to shift. And here's what I really want you to hear today. The stories we formed in childhood, I'm not enough, I'm too much, I'm unlovable, I'm a burden, I have to earn my place. These stories felt like truth. They were formed at a time when we had no way of questioning them. We were children. We didn't have the perspective, the language, or the cognitive development to look at our experience and say, wait, is this actually true? Or is this just what this environment taught me to believe? But you're not a child anymore, and that matters enormously because now you have something you didn't have then. You have the capacity to look at these stories and ask whether they're actually accurate, not to dismiss them, not to push them away, but to give them a genuine examination, to ask, where did this belief come from? What was happening around me when I formed it? Does it actually apply to who I am in the life I'm living now? One of the few things I find most meaningful in therapy is the moment when someone starts to separate what happened to them from what they decided it meant about them. Because those are two very different things. Something painful happened, that's obviously real, but the meaning that it got attached to it, that I'm damaged, that I'm unworthy, that I don't deserve good things, that meaning was created by a child trying to make sense of something they didn't have the tools to understand. It was never the truth. It was a survival story. And survival stories can be rewritten. I want to say something about what working with childhood wounds actually looks like, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about this. People sometimes imagine that therapy means going back and reliving painful memories in vivid detail, or that they have to confront family members, or that it involves years of excavating the past before anything in the present can change. In my experience, it's usually a lot quieter than that, a lot more about the present than people expect. Working through old wounds looks like noticing in real time when an old story is running, when you're in a conversation with your partner, and something in you suddenly goes very small and quiet. Be able to ask yourself, is this actually about right now? Or is this an old feeling that got activated? It looks like starting to develop a little bit of space between the trigger and the reaction. Not suppressing the reaction, but understanding it. It looks like learning to offer yourself the kind of understanding you might offer a good friend. If a good friend came to you and said things you said to yourself in the worst moments, you'd never speak to them the way your inner voice speaks to you. Working through old wounds means slowly, gradually extending some of that same compassion inward. Not because you're letting yourself off the hook, but because self-compassion is actually the ground from which real change grows. Looks like building something new. An experience that slowly updates an old story. Because stories don't change just through insight, they change through experience. When you take a risk in a relationship and the other person stays, when you ask for help and it's given without conditions, when you allow yourself to be seen, really seen, and the world doesn't end, each of those moments is a small piece of evidence that the old story might not be the whole truth. I want to leave you with this today. The stories you carry about yourself, the ones you say that say you're too much or not enough or fundamentally flawed in some way, these stories have a history. They were formed by a child who was trying to survive and make sense of a world they had very little control over. They were never really about who you are. They were about what you had to adapt to. And the fact that you're here listening to this and asking these questions about yourself, that tells me something. It tells me that some part of you already knows that the story doesn't have to stay the way it is. There might be a different way of understanding yourself, a different way of living. That's not a small thing. That's actually the beginning. If today's episode resonated with you, I'd like to really encourage you to share it with someone in your life who might hear something useful in it. And if you're in the Toronto area and you're thinking of starting therapy or just curious about the process would look like, you're welcome to reach out. My website is www.jimsquire.org, and I'd love to hear from you through any of our social media outlets and YouTube channel. Drop me a line, send me a message. And if you have a suggestion for other topics that may interest you, I'd love to hear them. Take care.